Another aspect of social and emotional development is the development of social bonds. And when it comes to social bonds, one of the things that we see as being pretty important is the development of an attachment relationship. And in fact, throughout our lifetimes, we'll develop a number of different attachments. An attachment is defined as a lasting emotional bond that one person has with another. And again, we develop a number of those throughout our lifetimes, but it's suggested that the attachment relationships that we develop early on in infancy sort of set the stage for how we experience attachments later in life. So it's argued that those relationships that we experience and the quality of those relationships when we're really, really young during that period of infancy are key. So psychologists have theorized about attachment relationships for a long time. And some of those early theories of attachment suggested that we develop attachments with people who provide us with those things we need in order to survive. So particularly food. And in fact, Freud touched on this a little bit. Freud suggested that we develop an attachment bond with that person who provides us with that oral gratification. But other theorists have suggested that it's a matter of getting that physical need for food met. However, other theorists came along and suggested that there was more to it than simply having those physiological needs for food met. And some of their theories were rooted in the work of researchers like the Harlows, who did research with rhesus monkeys. The Harlows were especially interested in how babies would develop in different situations, and so they used rhesus monkeys as a model for human babies, and they studied how these monkeys responded in different situations. And so one of the situations that they would raise some monkeys in was in complete isolation. And as you can imagine, that didn't bode well for those monkeys. Those monkeys didn't develop very adaptive types of behaviors and that kind of thing. But one pretty famous study that Harry Harlow and his wife conducted involved raising rhesus monkeys in a cage where they had access to two surrogate mothers. Now, these surrogate mothers were not real monkeys, they were wire monkeys, but one of those wire monkeys was simply made out of wire and had an area where a bottle could be attached. So the monkey could go there to get nourishment. But the other wire surrogate had this nice soft cloth covering that the baby monkeys could get close to, they could cuddle up with, and that would give them some physical contact and maybe even provide comfort in the sense that just having that soft contact can be comforting. And what they did is they observed the monkeys to see where they spent the most time. And it turns out that the majority of the monkeys in their study spent just enough time with that wire surrogate that provided food to get the nourishment that they needed. But then they would spend much more time with that wire surrogate that was covered in cloth. So they tended to prefer spending time with the cloth mother, as that cloth mother provided more comfort. And so, with the work of the Harlows, theorists begin to suggest that that type of comfort, that physical comfort, that contact, that plays a really significant role in the development of attachment relationships. Now, an early attachment theorist was a gentleman named John Bowlby, and he identified different milestones in the development of attachment. And so he talked about these milestones in terms of different phases, what he called the pre-attachment phase, the attachment in the making phase, and then the focused attachment phase. He suggested that in this pre-attachment phase, that this is in those first weeks and early months of life, and this is when babies are doing all of those cute things that make us want to be around them, that make us want to take care of them, and that sort of thing. He suggested that those first social smiles, which appear at the sight of another face at about 6 to 8 weeks of age, that those are biologically programmed to delight adults and to charm adults into caring for them. Another thing that has been suggested along with this is that some of those features that babies have, that feature of being cute, that may help with this pre-attachment phase. These cute features include things like rounded features, larger eyes, those sort of things that you see in this baby on this slide, but also in the puppy and in these little Kewpie dolls here, that those are things that may motivate parents to provide care and attention to their offspring. And those cute features are found in baby mammals, including infants, puppies, kittens. So it's suggested that that's designed for a purpose and that it aids in this pre-attachment phase. And then there is the attachment in the making phase. And in the attachment in the making phase, this is when babies and those caregivers are having a lot more interaction with one another. Babies are much more responsive during this stage. They have more control over their actions, so their motor skills and things like that. But they also have the ability to intentionally smile and do certain things. And they're learning about how they influence their environment and how their environment influences them as well. You may remember from when we talked about cognitive development again, in that sensory motor stage in Piaget's theory, he talked about that period when children engage in secondary circular reactions. So they're acting to have an effect on things outside their body, and they repeat those actions because they find them interesting. And a lot of those secondary circular reactions may involve other people. And so this, he argued, is part of that process of developing an attachment. And then the focused attachment is that phase where that attachment relationship is pretty much developed. It is there. And so a few of the things that he suggested we see during that focused attachment phase include that separation anxiety and stranger anxiety or stranger wariness that we talked about in the emotions video. But related to that, particularly to that stranger anxiety, we also begin to see babies making use of what's called social referencing. And social referencing is when, in the presence of a stranger or a strange situation, babies look to that trusted caregiver to see how they're responding to that new person or that new situation. And the idea is they're taking their cues from that trusted person. If that trusted person also shows fear or is pretty wary of that individual, then the baby may assume there's something to be feared here. But if that trusted person, that caregiver, is pretty open to that new situation and that new person, then the baby may be more accepting of that as well. So they're making use of social referencing. They're referring to those trusted social figures to see how they should behave or how they should respond to those others in their environment. Now, because our responses to strange situations and strange people invoke that social referencing, one researcher who studied attachment suggested that we could make use of that as a way to identify different types of attachment relationships and see something, get some information about the quality of the attachment relationship that a particular child has developed with that adult or that attachment figure. Mary Ainsworth was a researcher who, through her work, she's helped us better understand different aspects of infant attachment and the subtypes of attachment. And she's done this through her strange situation procedure. She would bring babies and that trusted caregiver into a room, and then they would kind of go through the steps in this strange situation procedure and see how babies responded. So to begin with, the caregiver and the infant were brought into the room and they were left alone in the room, and then they would observe how did the babies behave, and then a stranger would enter the room. After the stranger entered the room, they would introduce the first separation. The caregiver would leave the room and they would observe how the baby responded to that caregiver's absence. What did they do when the caregiver left them in the room with that person that they weren't familiar with? But after a short period of time, the caregiver would come back. And so there would be a first reunion. And they wanted to see how did the infant respond to the return of the caregiver. And then they basically just repeated that. They had a second separation where the caregiver left and the stranger re-enters the testing room. And then a second reunion. And so they wanted to see how do babies respond when that stranger comes into the room and their trusted caregiver is there. How do they respond when the trusted caregiver leaves, and then when the trusted caregiver returns? Based on her observations of babies in this strange situation procedure, Ainsworth suggested that children develop different types of attachment. And to begin with, she identified 3 basic types of attachment, what she called an insecure avoidant, a secure attachment, and an insecure resistant ambivalent attachment. But later, a disorganized type of attachment relationship was observed. And these were observed on the basis of babies in that strange situation procedure. So these are some of the behaviors that were characteristic of babies with these different types of attachment relationships as they went through that procedure. So you can pause the video here and read through those different types of attachment relationships. Based on the research of Mary Ainsworth and others, there's evidence to suggest that what's important in terms of the development of a positive attachment or a secure attachment is that caregivers are sensitive to the signals that they're getting from babies and that they respond to those signals in a consistent and sensitive way. And so a term that we use to describe this type of experience is synchrony. Synchrony involves, how in sync are adults with that baby's needs. How aware are they? How sensitive are they to the child's signals and needs? And then how do they respond to those signals and needs? So what we mean by synchrony is that sensitivity, and when parents are more sensitive to a baby's signals, then that seems to be conducive to the development of a secure attachment. But if parents are not that sensitive, if they miss those signals, or maybe they don't interpret them correctly and so don't respond appropriately, then that may lead to a more insecure type of attachment relationship in those babies. So it's suggested that the infant's attachment category often mirrors the caregiver's working model of attachment. So it's not just the infant who has certain patterns in terms of relationships. Their caregiver does as well. And so it's argued that based on those experiences that we have when we're young, we develop a working model, an understanding of how relationships go and that type of thing. And that those infants, what they do sort of mirrors what those adults, what the caregiver's model of attachment is. But it's not just the behavior of the adult or the caregiver. The child's temperament and a caregiver's other significant others also play a role in all of this. So other factors come into play when it comes to those attachment relationships.